There are moments in a performer's life that cannot be rehearsed. Moments that arrive without warning, that cut through the choreography of a professional career and demand something that no amount of stage experience can prepare you for. Neil Diamond had performed thousands of shows. He had sung through technical failures, through personal grief, through the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 5 decades giving everything he has to a room full of strangers. He had never stopped a show for any of it. Until the night he did. The concert was midway through its second hour. The arena was full. The band was locked in. The crowd was doing what Neil Diamond crowds always did. Singing back, swaying, inhabiting the songs the way people inhabit music that has been part of their lives for years. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. And then Neil Diamond walked to the front of the stage, held up his hand and asked everyone to leave. Not a technical problem. Not a medical emergency. Not a fire alarm or a power failure. He asked 18,000 people who had paid for their tickets and waited in line and driven hours to be there, to please go home. Almost everyone did. One person refused. What happened between Neil Diamond and that one person, in an arena that had just emptied around them, would not become public for years. When it finally did, the people who heard the story found themselves unable to explain why it moved them the way it did. It was not a dramatic story. It was not a rescue or a revelation or a moment of public heroism. It was something quieter than that. Something that only makes sense when you understand who Neil Diamond was, what that night had cost him, and why the one person who stayed was exactly the right person to stay. This is that story. To understand the night Neil Diamond stopped his concert, you have to understand what that concert meant to him. It was the autumn of 1987. Neil was 46 years old. He was in the middle of what his industry called a comeback, a word he disliked because it implied that he had been away and he had never been away. He had simply been in a period of reassessment, which is a different thing entirely. The years between his commercial peak and this tour had not been empty years. They had been years of writing, of questioning, of sitting in hotel rooms and asking himself whether the songs he was making were still coming from the right place or whether they had begun to come from the place that all long careers eventually produce: habit. The distinction mattered enormously to him. It had always mattered. From the very beginning of his career, from the early days of writing songs for other people in the Brill Building offices of Tin Pan Alley, from the first performances in small clubs where the audience was indifferent and the pay was barely enough to cover the cab home, Neil Diamond had understood that there were two kinds of performing. There was the performance that came from genuine emotional necessity, from the specific hunger of a person who has something to say and needs to say it in this form. And there was the performance that came from professional competence, technically correct, aesthetically acceptable, and completely without the interior charge that separated music from entertainment. He had spent his career in pursuit of the first kind. He had not always achieved it. No performer does across 5 decades and thousands of shows. But the pursuit was the thing that had kept him honest, and the moments when he felt it achieved, when a song landed in a room with the full weight of what it was written to carry, those were the moments he had built everything else around. The tour had been his response to a growing private fear that he was losing access to those moments. He had rebuilt his show from the ground up, not the production, which remained substantial, but the interior of it. The choices about which songs to include, what order to play them in, what kind of emotional journey the evening was supposed to make. He had wanted the shows to feel less like greatest hits evenings and more like genuine performances. He had wanted to sing as though every song was being discovered in real time, not delivered from memory. It had mostly worked. The reviews were good. The crowds were engaged in the way he wanted them to be engaged. Present, not simply nostalgic. There were nights when he came off stage feeling that something real had happened, that the music had done what music is supposed to do. Nights when he could feel the connection between what he had written and what the audience received, the specific electricity of a feeling transmitted and recognized, of private experience becoming communal without losing its essential truth. And then there were the other nights. The night in question was in Cincinnati. A large arena on a Wednesday evening, sold out, the kind of crowd that arrives already warm, people who have been looking forward to this for weeks, who have organized their schedules around it, who bring with them an expectation of joy that a performer either meets or quietly disappoints. Neil had arrived at the venue that afternoon in a state he would later describe in private conversations as simply wrong. Not ill. Not afraid. Not angry at anyone or anything specific. Simply wrong. The particular condition of a person whose interior weather has nothing to do with the exterior circumstances and who cannot locate the source of the wrongness or find a way to correct it before the curtain goes up. He had felt it before. Most performers have. The show goes on anyway, and usually the performance itself corrects the wrongness. The contact with the audience, the physical act of singing, the way that music pulls you into the present and holds you there. The lights come up. The first note sounds. The crowd responds. And the person who walked on stage carrying whatever they were carrying is replaced, for the duration of the show, by the performer who knows exactly what he is doing and why. This night it did not fix it. He performed for 90 minutes. The crowd was with him. The band was excellent. The production was everything it was supposed to be. Hit after hit arrived and was received with the warmth of long familiarity, songs that had been part of people's lives for decades, songs that carried the specific emotional freight of the moments in which they had first been heard. Sweet Caroline brought 18,000 people to their feet. Hello Again produced the particular quiet that his ballads always produced, a room of people collectively remembering something. And underneath all of it, in the place where the performance was supposed to be rooted, the place where the songs came from, the place where feeling and craft met, there was something absent that he could not name and could not replace with technique. He was delivering the songs. He was not inhabiting them. The difference is not visible from the audience. It is not something that shows up in a review or registers on a recording. It is a private knowledge, available only to the performer, that the emotional truth of what he is doing has been separated from the technical execution of it, that the shell of the performance is present and the interior of it is not. That what the crowd is receiving is a very good imitation of the thing rather than the thing itself. For a performer of lesser self-awareness, this would not have been a crisis. But Neil Diamond had spent his entire career fighting against exactly this. Against the performance that is technically correct and emotionally hollow, against the version of himself that goes through the motions with sufficient skill that the motions pass for something real. It was the specific failure he feared most. And on this night in Cincinnati, it was the failure he was committing in front of 18,000 people who did not know it was happening and could not have named it if they had. He stopped at the end of a song. Not dramatically. He simply stood at the microphone for a moment longer than usual, looking out at the arena. And then he said, calmly and without elaboration, that he was sorry. That he needed to stop. That the show was over for tonight and that everyone should go home, and that their tickets would be refunded in full. The arena went quiet. Then it went confused. Then, as the reality of what he had just said settled in, it went through the stages that 18,000 people go through when something completely unexpected has happened in a context where everything is supposed to be predictable. There was murmuring. There were questions directed at security staff who had no answers. There was a gradual, disbelieving movement toward the exits. People looking at each other, looking back at the stage, looking again at the exits, making the calculation that a man who had just apologized and said to go home probably meant it. Neil's manager was in the wings. His tour manager. His publicist. All of them trying simultaneously to understand what had just happened and to manage the operational consequences of it. A sold-out show stopped midway through. 18,000 ticket holders who needed to be communicated with. Press who would have questions before morning. A statement that would need to be crafted carefully enough to explain without over-explaining, to acknowledge without inviting the kind of scrutiny that a stopped show could generate if the story was not managed correctly. The logistics were significant. But Neil did not come off the stage. He stood at the front of it, watching the arena empty, until the arena was almost empty. Almost. In the front row, in a seat that had been directly in front of him for the entire show, there was a woman who had not moved. She was in her 60s. She was alone, the seat beside her empty, the people on either side of her now part of the departing crowd. She was not making any gesture of protest or statement. She had not risen to argue with security, had not raised her voice, had not done anything to draw attention to herself. She was simply sitting in her seat with her coat folded on her lap, looking up at him with an expression that contained no demand and no judgment and no particular expectation. She was just there. Neil's security team had begun moving through the arena, gently directing the last stragglers toward the exits. One of them approached the woman in the front row and, with the practiced courtesy of a professional who delivers unwelcome news for a living, explained that the show was over and asked her to make her way out. She shook her head. Not rudely. Not defiantly. Simply with the calm certainty of someone who has decided something and is not going to undecide it because someone in a uniform has suggested otherwise. The security guard looked toward the stage, uncertain how to proceed with a refusal that was not aggressive and not confused but simply, quietly, firm. Neil, who had been watching this exchange, gave a small nod. Leave her. The arena finished emptying. The crowd sounds faded. The noise of departure, the shuffling and the murmuring and the distant conversations about what had just happened, receded and then disappeared as the doors swung shut behind the last of the 18,000. The lights shifted to the work lights that come on after a show, Harsh, industrial, the theater stripped of its magic and returned to the building it actually is. The band had packed up and left. The crew was beginning the process of breakdown that follows every performance, moving through the arena with the efficient purposefulness of people who have done this 1,000 times and know that the fastest way out is the most direct way through. Neil sat down on the edge of the stage. The woman in the front row was perhaps 20 feet away from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The arena held its strange post-concert silence. Not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of a space that had recently been full, that still carried in its air the warmth and noise of what had just been there and was now gone. A residual presence, fading. Then Neil said, "You didn't have to stay." She looked at him without particular surprise, as though she had been expecting him to say something eventually and was in no hurry. "I know," she said. Her voice was unhurried. Midwestern. The voice of someone who was not performing composure but simply felt it. "Why did you?" She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was searching for the answer, but with the quality of someone considering how to say something she already knows. Then she said something that Neil would remember for the rest of his life, not because it was profound or surprising but because it was so precisely accurate that it landed somewhere he had not known was available to be landed in. She said, "Because you looked like someone who shouldn't be alone right now." The arena was very quiet around them. The crew moved at a respectful distance. The work lights hummed overhead, indifferent. Outside, the Cincinnati night continued at its ordinary pace. Cars on the highway, people going home from other evenings, the city moving through Wednesday the way cities move through all their days, without reference to what is happening inside any particular building. Neil looked at the woman for a long moment. "My name is Neil," he said. It was an absurd thing to say. She knew his name. Everyone in the arena had known his name. But it was the only way he could think of to begin the kind of conversation that was not a performance, that had no script, that required him to be a person rather than a professional. "I know," she said again with a small, genuine smile. "My name is Margaret." They talked for 2 hours. Not about the show. Not about the decision to stop it, which Neil did not fully explain and Margaret did not press him on. They talked about the things that people talk about when they have been unexpectedly placed in each other's company and have decided, without quite deciding, to be honest with a stranger in a way that is sometimes easier than being honest with the people who know you. Margaret was a retired schoolteacher from a suburb of Cincinnati. She had been a Neil Diamond fan since the early 1970s, when her late husband had introduced her to his music on a road trip they took before they were married. It had been autumn then too. She remembered that detail, remembered the specific quality of the light and the particular song that was playing when she heard it for the first time and understood why her husband loved it. The music had become part of the texture of their life together after that. Present at moments of celebration and at moments of loss, threaded through the decades in the way that music attaches itself to a life when it arrives at the right time and stays. Her husband had died 14 months earlier. This was the first Neil Diamond concert she had attended alone. She had almost not come. The tickets had been purchased together more than a year before, during a period when the future had still felt like a place that would contain both of them. The question of whether to use the second ticket or leave it empty or give it away had been one of the smaller practical sorrows of grief. The accumulated tickets and reservations and plans that a death leaves behind, each one requiring a small separate decision about what to do with what was supposed to be shared. She had come alone. She had sat in the seat that was supposed to be his. And she had listened to the music that had been the music of their life together and felt both the presence and the absence of the person who had given it to her, the specific doubled sensation of grief at a concert, where the music calls back the person who is gone and the empty seat beside you confirms that they are gone, and both of these things are true at the same time and there is no way to hold them that does not hurt. When Neil had stopped the show, she had not wanted to leave. Not because she was angry or felt she was owed anything, but because the arena, suddenly emptied of its noise and crowd and performance, felt like exactly the right kind of place to be for a while. Quiet. Large. Holding the echo of something that had just been there and was now gone. It reminded her, she told him, of her house in the weeks after her husband died, the way large quiet spaces held absence differently than small ones, the way the size of the silence was somehow commensurate with the size of what was missing. She was, in other words, exactly where she needed to be. Neil listened to all of this with an attention he had been trying to bring to the performance and had not been able to find there. The specific, focused attention that comes when you are no longer responsible for filling the space with something and can simply be present to what is in it. He asked questions. He let her speak. He did not offer observations about grief or comfort or the passage of time, because none of those things were what was needed. What was needed was someone to listen, and he was, in that emptied arena on a Wednesday night in Cincinnati, able to do that without reservation. He understood, as the conversation continued, that he had stopped the show for reasons he had not fully understood when he stopped it. The wrongness he had felt on stage was not simply a performance problem or a mood problem but something more particular, the sense that the songs were being directed at an abstraction rather than a person. That the warmth he projected was going out into a crowd and dissipating before it arrived anywhere specific. Here was somewhere specific. Here was a woman who had sat in the front row for 90 minutes with a grief so quiet and so complete that it had reached him through the lights and the sound and all the machinery of a professional performance, and had told him without words that the music meant something beyond what the music knew it meant. That it was doing something in her that it had been designed to do and that it had been doing in people for 20 years. Reaching into a private place, touching something that had no other name, saying something that needed to be said in exactly this way and no other. He had stopped the show because he felt he was failing to do that. She had stayed because she knew he was not. Near the end of their conversation, Neil picked up the guitar that had been left on the stage, one of the acoustic guitars from the show, never fully packed away. He played a song. Not one from the set list. Something older, quieter, written in the early years of his career when the songs were rawer and the ambition was simpler and the need to be heard was the only thing that mattered. He played it for Margaret and only for Margaret, in an empty arena with work lights overhead and the crew quietly continuing in the background and the Cincinnati night outside. She listened with the complete attention of someone who is receiving something at exactly the right moment. Not analyzing. Not performing appreciation. Simply present with the music and with what it was doing to her in real time. When it finished, she sat with it for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," Neil said. It was, in its simplicity, the most complete exchange the evening had produced. Margaret left shortly after. She drove home to her suburb, to the house that was too quiet, to the life that was in the process of becoming something she had not chosen and was learning to inhabit anyway. She did not speak publicly about what had happened for many years, not because she had been asked not to, but because it felt private. Something that belonged to the specific geography of that emptied arena and that time of night and would lose something essential if it were moved into the ordinary light of day. Neil finished the tour. The Cincinnati show was described in press materials as having been cut short due to the performer feeling unwell, which was not precisely true but was not entirely false either. The refunds were processed without incident. The story was contained. The incident receded into the background noise of a long career, remembered by 18,000 people as the night something strange happened but not yet understood as anything more than that. But Neil did not forget Margaret. He made inquiries through his management, which took some time and required some delicacy, and eventually made contact. He sent a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, not a form communication from a publicist. He thanked her for staying. He told her that the conversation had given him something he had not known he was missing and could not have found any other way. He did not attempt to explain what that something was with precision because it did not reduce well to precision. It was too specific, too dependent on the particular circumstances of that night and that arena and the two people who had been left in it. She wrote back. They exchanged letters several times over the following years, not frequently, not on a schedule, but with the quality of a correspondence between two people who have no obligation to each other and therefore no reason to write except that the writing itself is worth doing. Letters about ordinary things. About her grandchildren, who were growing up in a world her husband would not see. About his music, which she continued to listen to and which continued to do what it had always done for her, which was to make the private feeling nameable. He dedicated one of his later albums in the liner notes to M, who stayed. No last name. No explanation. The dedication was noticed by some fans and puzzled over without resolution across many years, which was exactly as it should have been. The story behind it was not a secret, but it was not a press release either. It existed in the middle distance between private and public where the most important things tend to live. The night in Cincinnati became, in Neil Diamond's private accounting of his career, one of the most significant nights he had spent on a stage. Not because of what happened during the show, which was, by his own admission, a failure of the kind that matters most to him, but because of what happened after. Because of the accident of one person's quiet decision not to leave, and the conversation that decision made possible, and the understanding it produced about what performing was for and what it was not for and where the line between those two things actually ran. He had spent his career filling arenas. On the most important night, the arena was empty. And the music he played that night, one song, no microphone, no production, no lights, was the most honest performance he had given in years. Not because Margaret deserved it more than the 18,000 who had left, But because the 18,000 had come to hear Neil Diamond, and Margaret had stayed to be with another person who was, like her, simply trying to find somewhere to put the weight of an ordinary human evening. He had given her that. She had given him something he could not have bought or scheduled or produced through the accumulated craft of a 50-year career, the reminder that the songs were never really for the crowd. They were for the one person in the crowd who needed them at that exact moment, in that exact way, for reasons the songwriter would never fully know. He had written every one of them for that person. He had just never met her before.